We are back on Valentine's Day. And you know, as a day to celebrate love and the loves of our lives, what better than to be sitting here for 3 panels in a row about our greatest love, snow sports, sliding around on snow, with apologies to everyone's significant other. But anyway, happy Valentine's Day, everybody. I'm very happy to be joined by these 3 folks for reasons that if those reasons aren't already clear to you, they are about to get clear to you, I think. But this is a very cool panel, and a number of people that I have told about this are like, how are you doing this? And so expectations are very high for the 3 of you. And really, our job here is to be thinking about ski bindings. And I think we're gonna run the gamut from AT bindings to Alpine. And then I really wanna see, kind of try to get into the mind of these 3 folks to see what might be down the road when it comes to ski bindings, a piece of equipment that maybe some of us don't think too much about. So, to get started, I'm going to go Giray and then Lars and then Hoji, because Hoji likes to talk for a while. And so we're gonna put him last on this one. But Giray, could you tell people a bit about you and your company and a little bit of your relationship to this whole world of bindings?
I'm Giray Dadali. I've had quite a full circle career from professional skiing and slopestyle, half pipe and rails primarily, and then transitioned into backcountry. And so a lot of what I've done is backcountry jump specialist. And these guys are a little bit more in the freeride realm, big mountain stuff. Took on engineering for J skis. I engineer with Forefront. I started a company, Daymaker Touring, in 2016, making Alpine adapters. And have had my hands dipped into all sorts of other companies and have worked in the biomedical world for engineering as well. So coming at this from a guy with a ton of injuries, tons of time on snow, and utilized a lot of different gear in my life.
Lars.
I've was part of the free skiing tour for a long time. That was the last reason I was here. It was long, 10 years ago. From that, I moved on to starting to cast touring, which is I guess the first hybrid touring binding out there. And I've been just trying to figure out how to make a binding that does everything really well for the last 10 years. So, yeah.
So Lars, my question is, what led you to start cast?
It was just we were skiing on tour, just skiing in general. 10 years ago, it was pretty much Dynafit or Trekkers. I guess Fritchies were a thing, but there was nothing that was reliable to tour on and ski down that was also efficient to let us ski the way we wanted to. So that was the main incentive, and I went from full gamut of all the different options to do it, and then realized I would just not try to make anything not what it was and take what existed, which was pin bindings, and then Alpine bindings, and just make a way to use both of them. And that was the start. And we made a little quick change system, and it's just evolved into better versions of that over the last 10 years. And still pretty much the same basic idea. And there's been now quite a few other people have tried to solve that problem in different ways. And it's been cool to see that progression. And it's also really legitimized us as not just out there on the fringe taking stuff off our skis. So, yeah.
Hoji, where do you fit into all this?
There you go. Yeah, I didn't really do much with bindings, I guess. I guess my piece of the puzzle was from the early times of 10 plus years ago was kind of took a chance with low-tech bindings, Dynafit bindings, to when the boots started coming, that the first boots with inserts that were compatible, that finally were, after 20, 30 years of the only boots that were compatible with these minimalist bindings that were made specifically for ski touring, were skiing wasn't the primary use, or like downhill performance wasn't the focus, it was walking. And yeah, 2009-10, they made like a 4-buckle overlap boot with inserts, and I contacted them, got some boots and bindings, and yeah, put them to use, and just tried to like see what, you know, if they could work, because at that time, like the tech bindings, the low tech bindings, and primarily it was Dynafit was the main company in the market. They had existed and they were very accepted in the ski touring world, racing, randonnée racing, and like really like backcountry skiing. People concerned about getting up, getting down, or going on traverses, and weight was the primary focus. But there weren't many people. There were ski mountaineers doing crazy descents all over the world for 20, 30 years already, like trusting that system. But kind of how skiing evolved into this free ride skiing, there wasn't many takers on seeing if that binding could, you know, perform in a way, or if it was acceptable for free riding. So I was kind of this guinea pig test pilot. There was others, of course, it wasn't just me, but that's where I got started.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So let's talk about this, what's acceptable, right? It seems like this is the kind of already now age-old question, hotly debated, right? Often you are cited, Hoji, of like, tech bindings are fine, go ski hard stuff in them. I mean, Hoji does, right? Like, you've probably been part of a conversation that has gone like that. And so how do you all think about this question of what is acceptable or wise to do across the gamut of bindings?
For me, I would put the level of acceptability for what I want to do in the backcountry to be, if I'm not comfortable riding Crested Butte in these conditions right now and flowing at my top level in that binding, I'm pretty much not going to take that in the backcountry. So that's why I have an adapter system, so that I can use that binding that I trust inbounds and out of bounds. And that's where I put my level of acceptability, is I can trust its release setting. I can trust that it's going to hold me in, but more importantly, I can trust that it's going to release when I need it to, so I don't suffer another injury compounding in my career.
And for people who maybe aren't so familiar with Daymakers, man, it's an easy thing once you've seen it, but I was just thinking, like, how would I actually describe that? And I would do that badly. So have you dialed that in?
It's an insert that attaches to your boot and plugs into your normal downhill ski binding, just like your boot would. You can tour uphill with it. It gives you heel releasability. When you reach the top of a mountain, you take it off and you put it in your backpack. It doesn't change the way that you ski. You're using your normal ski binding. That's it in a nutshell, but it's compatible across the board of every single ski binding on the market. So you don't have to say, oh, I need to use a marker griffin with this. I need to use a pivot with that. Everyone's got gear in their closet. They want to use each ski they want for a different day. Conditions out there are always changing, and so that's why we have quivers. So adaptability has been really important to me, and why I push that system.
What's the price on it?
About $320.
Okay. Hoji, this whole question of like what's acceptable, and some people being like, you're crazy for doing that in this binding, you know, one, do you get that question a lot, and how do you talk about that?
Yeah, I've wasted a few hours of my life with that, but I mean, it's a personal choice, and my needs and my accepted like risk, or what I'm like, I put in the time. I started skiing those bindings, and through my own process, developed trust, and like I was blown away, and it speaks to like how well they are designed for the time they came from, that they could fulfill in a way what skiing has become, like the requirements. So it's a personal choice, and like at the end of the day, for many years now, like I've been very focused on more of backcountry skiing, and like you have to get to the top. You want efficiency. You spend 95+% of your day walking and going uphill, and I mean that was the TSN turning point for me. Was like I've been skiing my whole life, and the whole time we're relying on chairlifts, and in Canada or here too, like snowmobiles and all mechanical things, and like, but the mountains are just there, and like skiing could be more than just going down. Like that's what skiing was from the beginning. From that's why skis exist, was for traveling through snow in the mountains on your feet. And I felt like I just want to go over there, but I can't, you know. And this was a personal choice, and like getting away from everything, and just, I'm a powder junkie, and like these light bindings and this kind of setup for those conditions are actually, that's what I discovered. It's like, it's actually very good. Okay, yeah, not like pushing it and doing jumps and all this stuff. That's not what it was made for, but actually just like powder skiing, it's fine in a way, and it's great for going up. And the more I got used to it, the more I like accepted the compromise, or whatever you might say, and came to actually really appreciate like removing all this weight. Like I'm a light, small person, and all the weight I could shed off of me, suddenly I can like jump way in the air, and like I feel it's like a different style. You want to be nimble and quick and fast, and like the less weight you have to move around on your body, on your feet, it becomes easier. You can be more dynamic. But the compromise, or whatever the opposite end is, like when you have that mass on your feet and on your skis and on your bindings, and you just become a bulldozer, and you can plow through everything. And like, so it's a personal like style or choice. So that's kind of the direction I chose, or I fell into, and yeah, for me it was okay. But I'm tiny and I'm weak. And my boots are small.
That's right. Yeah. Between your weakness and your tininess and your tiny boots, I don't even know how you make it down the mountain sometimes. Lars, the acceptable question.
I think that sort of ties into everything we do in the mountains. It's all about risk management. We got into that a lot last night with athletes, and there's all different types of things out there, you know, whether you're carrying your Abbey gear, whether you're wearing a helmet. And I feel like bindings are one of the few pieces of equipment that's specifically designed with safety in mind. Alpine bindings were designed to solve a specific problem of lower leg injuries, and they've done a very good job of that throughout the years. And I think like it is a personal preference. There's uses for everything, and I think where we've gone is sort of what both of these guys addressed. We wanted what Giray had as, you know, the most bomber binding you could have every time you ski. And for me, in a comfort level, I'm out there to ski and just enjoy the mountains, and I don't want to have to modify my style based on the day or where I'm at, you know, and think about what skis I'm on. I ski the same skis every day of the year, whether I'm sled skiing, touring, at the resort, and it's just a comfort thing for me, you know. And then I think as our company, we just tried to get both of those things, and we have the efficiency of a pin binding with, you know, a full-on Alpine binding. We sacrifice a little on weight and change out, but that's sort of what it is. And if people are willing to make that, then it works well. And I think, as Hoji was talking about, it's like, if you're aware of what you're skiing, if you're skiing powder and you're Hoji and you don't fall, then pin bindings are perfectly acceptable. If you're the rest of us and you do, then you might want a binding that's designed to, you know, prevent injury. And yeah, I mean, there's days I go out and ski without a helmet. There's days I go out, you know, and ski without partners in the backcountry. But it's like, it's all just about that. And for me, having the consistency of my bindings and skis gives me the confidence to know that I can handle the situations. If I see something I want to jump off, I can without thinking about it. You know, if stuff starts to move, I can stop turning and go to the bottom. It's just like, I don't know. It is what it is. It's like one of the many things that you bring with you, and it often gets overlooked. You know, whether it's someone locking out their pin bindings and not realizing that ski's not going to come off if they slide, or their heel might release and it's still going to cause damage, you know. It's a lot of stuff that's, yeah, it's easy to just not think about, I guess.
You all did a really good job, I think, of articulating these kind of 3 different points on this binding spectrum. And as you all were talking, what I'm thinking is, man, I don't feel like many skiers are clear on the kind of pros and cons and compromises. And that is, I don't actually even, I need to do better at thinking about how that got to be the case. But I don't think as an industry we're very good on this right now, just in terms of, because, you know, look, free country, let people make their own choices. I'm fine with that. But I think there's a lot of people that just aren't very clear on some of the differences in these designs, technologies, et cetera, et cetera. Do you agree with that, first of all?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, we're in a time of confusion here.
Yeah.
Like there's
Wow.
there's a lot of random stuff that just doesn't add, you know, like all the standards, all the different bindings, a bunch of like things trying to retrofit, and like no one actually like unless you read the standards and you know, and even I don't know, but like it's a very confusing time. I mean, people have been jamming touring boots and Alpine bindings for 10 years now, and like no one seemed to care. And then, oh well, now this whatever, the insert is outside the norms of the Alpine binding, and everyone made a big deal of it and all these things. But actually, like in the reality, the cross compatibility compromises were all the same, and like no one talks about it or thinks about that because it's just convenient to do what you can do at that time. So it needs to get streamlined a little bit, or divided into like 2 specific. Now we're trying to fix everything with things that we're dealing with 2 standards. One's the same age as me, for like 1984, and the other one's like 60 years old, I think. And skiing has changed a lot since that. So that's where the future, and like where we could take this conversation is like the sport of skiing and the requirements of the users, and like the amount of people and just the diversity of what everyone's expecting, from park skiers to alpine racers to pow skiing to ski randonnée. Like it's a huge amount of different requirements, and some of the, like where the main product sits is trying to solve all that and like retrofit things. So it gets very confusing very quickly.
Giray or Lars, are you sitting here frustrated about, what did you call it, the era of confusion? That was very...
Yeah, the age of confusion.
The age of
or
confusion.
something, yeah.
Damn, that's good.
Yes.
Are you guys sitting there thinking, yes, we agree, there's a lot of confusion, and this is clearly how you reduce confusion? Thoughts on this?
That's going to be a tough one. I don't know. I think that sort of goes back to starting at the beginning, and what alpine bindings are and what touring bindings are very different things, and they were created for very different reasons. As I said before, alpine bindings were created because skiing was suffering somewhat of an epidemic of lower leg injuries. The first bindings out there went from straps, strapping your boot to a wooden ski, in which case you couldn't turn, to mechanical. And once they went mechanical, all of a sudden you could turn. It was awesome. Skiing blossomed. But then essentially there was, a ton of lower leg injuries, twisting and boot top fractures. And we created a standard and products that eliminated that injury, not entirely, but to a huge extent. But they couldn't tour, and then I guess it was in the late 80s, early 90s, the pin bindings were invented sort of as the premier touring, but they were invented without any consideration of that. It was to solve the problem of moving through the mountains and still being able to ski. And I think for a long time, as long as Dynafit's patent lasted for 20 years, they sort of had the full monopoly on that, and people just accepted them as different things. And I think the confusion really started whenever that was, 2012, when that patent expired, and all of a sudden there was a huge incentive for the industry to just legitimize that, and make that segment bloom. And the way to make that segment bloom was to ignore the fact that those bindings didn't meet the safety standards of Alpine bindings. And there was a lot of, it wasn't really effort, it was just sort of turning the other cheek. Shop techs who would never let a binding leave their shop if it was an Alpine binding without passing certs and getting their identification were mounting pin bindings, sending people out on them and thinking nothing of it. And that's sort of just the baseline. And for us, we started in 2012. We're a tiny company. We didn't have the resources to get to certified or pass ISO standards. We did the testing to make sure our products met that safety standard, but it was sort of a blessing because there was so much confusion that we could just put the product out there. And there were a couple people who sort of called us out on it, but we knew that it was safe and worked like an Alpine binding. But had it been 10 years earlier, there wouldn't have been a shop in the country that would have mounted one for us. So, and that sort of continued, I think, with the advent of, as the Kingpin followed our first lead, and then the Shift, and now the Duke, that whole segment of trying to do both has become more mainstream, and people have realized that it's important to have a releasable binding, and the industry's trying to sort of reestablish that as something that's important. And it's hard to do, especially with the new boot standards. And, I've got one employee who handles our customer service, and he would very much attest to the confusion of all the boot, especially the boot standards. It's like there's now 3 or 4, and just we've created AFDs for all of them. It's just trying to figure out, to the average person, what works with what is a rather daunting task. And I think we've sort of reached a point where I don't see anything super new on the boot side coming out. So I think bindings will catch up and people will figure out what's going on. But it's not real clear how to get over that, 15 years of sort of pretending that these two things were equivalent.
But you have to meet Fritz because he actually.
I know Hoji and I've had a very good conversation about this, but yeah.
If you take the low tech bindings and you ski them unlocked on the skis of the time, he had to pass all kinds. It wasn't DIN, but he those bindings are he spent 20 years to make them. They do really it's. That's the problem is we're skiing on 100. 120 and sending it in huge boots that didn't ever fit in those bindings and locking them and all these things and all the work that he did has been completely ignored by other companies. He actually put in the effort. He didn't want people breaking their legs and bindings not coming off, and they were never intended to be ski locked. There's all the history that's been kind of glazed over. Those bindings were developed in their own standard to be safe. We're just pushing them. We're taking a carbon road bike and going in the Whistler Bike Park.
Yeah, that's
it's not really. The work was put in, and it was done in a way through a lot of time and effort and trial and error. So it's just the use of those bindings. We've kind of transformed it to what they were never, at the time, what they were meant to do on the skis and what skiing was, they were quite all right.
Yeah. You owe us a beer.
That's fine. Round of beers, I'll pay. I got my card. Yeah.
Yeah,
Please,
I'd agree with Hoji here with intended usage, I think is the biggest point to push. And in the end, everyone's in the industry to sell product. And so they'll do what it takes to try to sell their product. But for me personally, I answer so much customer service. And if someone says that their intended usage of getting out touring is to go do 10 miles, do 4,000 vert, I'm not going to push them to my own system. I'm going to push them to something else where the intended usage is that. And, for me, I'm into more, I'd say, like starter systems. And it just so happens that a starter system is really good for people trying to ski at a high level of jumps and cliffs too. Because I'm going to put the trust in the binding manufacturers who have put safety at the top of the line for 60 years, innovating on these bindings. So I try to take that question out of my hand and put it in the ballpark of those companies. So a big thing that I've faced is I make the adapter compatible with all different types of boots. And we have these changing boots all the time that Lars hit on. I saw walk to ride begin to hit the industry. I mean, what was that? What was the point? No one agreed upon that.
Yeah.
And then grip walk, I'm pretty sure there's some different heights. And I've 3D scanned every boot, every binding into my system to make it compatible with it all. And 1 millimeter makes the biggest difference. So to say that this boot has grip walk and it has grip walk on the side and it's a millimeter different in height is completely unacceptable. So
the only consistency in ski boot manufacturing or design is inconsistency. I promise you. I've been dealing with this.
I talked to Hoji here about a stat a little bit ago. It was about the width of pin inserts and the variance in this. Just saying, we need to meet standards across the board. And in the end, if something can reduce your holding power by 30 or 50%, how can you trust those numbers if just 1 or 2 millimeters makes all that difference?
A tenth of a millimeter. Everyone blames the binding. That's like when all this started happening, and I won't get into those details, but it's always the binding's fault. Oh, this shitty tech binding, whatever it is, and it's it's tenths of millimeters, and you're not even close, and the pin, you're shaking the insert it's side to side. It's a hot dog down the hallway situation.
That makes no sense. unless hot.
Jonathan hasn't had that issue.
That makes
Oh, you're a beer can.
this is some Canadian speak. Hot dog down the hallway. All right.
But it's always the binding that takes the blame. And the same, how many people are cramming kind of these walk to ride and all these different soles and Alpine bindings for 10 plus years, and no one seems to care. And it's you put those on any machine, go to the ski shop and test it, and it's completely compromised. There's no interface that's too thick, it's too high, it's rubber sitting pressed, preloaded down none of it is working actually.
Okay, so for people who own a ski boot with tech fittings, is the advice here take it into your shop and they can test that? Yeah. And then the question is, are you all talking about improper tolerance levels on a new boot or boots that get worn over time? Where are you seeing the bigger issue? New boots or, somebody who's got 60 days in a pin boot?
I think that goes back to the difference between pin bindings and Alpine bindings. There is a standard for Alpine bindings. That standard is plus or minus a millimeter, which 2 millimeters is a pretty significant amount. There's bindings that have adjustable toe heights. There's bindings that have preload on them. But 2 millimeters in an Alpine boot, that allows for wear over the life of the boot, manufacturing discrepancies. Most Alpine bindings can account for that. The different boot soles is a whole nother nightmare. We have 3 different AFDs for a binding, and we have to deal with talking through each customer which AFD fits their boot. But on the flip side, there is no standard for pin bindings. The closest thing there is is the Dynafit certified pins, which come from Dynafit and meet their standards. And as Hoji was saying, Dynafit put the work in to design a binding that released properly with their boots, you know, at the way it was designed. And that I fully respect, and it is something true. The frustration I think a lot of people experienced is, I don't know if it's Dynafit or the industry, that was just sort of held through proprietary technology, and it still is. The only thing that meets the standard is the Dynafit inserts. But it's such a small discrepancy. Whatever is a tenth of a millimeter in a pin binding on that tiny little metal-on-metal interface makes a huge difference. And those interfaces wear a handful of releases with a pin binding. We'll wear those to the point of being extremely different from factory versus, you know, an Alpine binding. That won't happen. And I think the issue within the tech binding world, Hoji probably could speak to this more than me, is that tolerance is so small, it's not feasible, or it would be pretty much impossible for binding or boot manufacturers to meet that tolerance in an economical way. If there was a standard like the boot standard, it would, you know, I don't know how many dollars, but it'd be hundreds of dollars a boot to hold that tolerance. And it would be awesome if that happened, because I think it would create a better pin binding and a better system, but it's just not super realistic. If you really want to get in the weeds on that one, a friend of mine from years ago in Utah, Jeff Campbell, did a whole PhD thesis on this, on the discrepancy between, and he's got some really good videos online. You can get into that, but yeah, that's a tough one to solve.
So could there be more adjustability in the actual pin binding itself to accommodate the differences in boot manufacturers? You guys have more experience than
I
me
mean,
with
that's
the
how
pin
they
binding.
started it.
Yeah.
It used to have, but I don't know enough, but it's just too much. It's too much. Like, you can't do that.
That might be, like going down the route of the future or the past. My biggest frustration with pin bindings is that interface works really well. It's a tight little pin. It gives you a pivot. It gives you holding. Had that interface been, you know, twice the size in a ball, you'd have way more surface area. You could actually have some movement in your toe, and actually like a release, that might be a better interface than an Alpine binding. Like if it was a full-on ball and socket versus a tiny little pin, that could be, but would take a complete paradigm shift of every single tech system.
But that's
binding
what
boot.
it's going to take. I can tell
Like,
you the story
it's
of,
like
of walking around ISPO, the last big one before the pandemic, and with Fritz. And he's just shaking his head. He's like, please, no more low-tech bindings. Why are we suffering this shit from the 80s? My ignorance from being an engineering student.
He just was like,
but
this
no
pin.
one can do anything. Like, what's going on here? Why can't anyone actually do anything?
Yeah, he picked a 5mm
yeah,
pointed
because he
pin.
wanted the lightest
And he wants the
possible
lightest
thing.
And if he had picked a half-inch ball, which would have still
He doesn't
pivoted,
go in inches, sorry.
or whatever you want. All right,
12 millimeters.
12.3 millimeters. Ball, it would have given us a ton of freedom. Like the Fritchie Tecton, I have a ton of respect for what they're trying to do. That interface is so small that it's like sort of doomed to failure. Like having arms that articulated, but had that been a bigger interface, you could have a ton of movement in a tech-style toe and have it releasable. And that just, we've gone, maybe 15 years ago, had Dynafit been like, oh, we're changing things up, we're the only game in town, we're going to change the size of our pins. It could have happened. Right now, it seems like it would take some company essentially launching an entire line of boots and bindings to overcome that, and that becoming more popular than everything else on the market, which doesn't seem super feasible.
We're handcuffed by standards, and no real innovation can happen. It's a bunch of band-aids, and none of it is good for anything. Like, it's just that we're suffering from mistakes of the past and things that were designed for what we're not actually doing anymore. But someone has to, that's what the low-tech story is, like fighting to create something better for 25 years before anyone other than the fringe users could accept it. So it's really a tough situation. I agree 100%, but it could be in a fantasy world, like it all makes sense. Like it doesn't have to be this way, actually.
Yeah, I would love to. Like, I could make a binding that would do that, but I
Yeah.
can't make
Yeah.
a line of boots or convince
Yeah.
everyone else to buy that binding. So,
No.
yeah, that's sort of where we're at, and that's why, to come full circle to where I started, was I just figured I would take these two things existed and figure out a way to make them work together, not try to make them
But independently.
something that didn't exist, you know, and that's, sort of our whole story, and I think there's a lot of room for improvement actually on the Alpine side of bindings, and that's where my head's at. But
You don't say.
yeah, there aren't any other companies. I guess, like, listening to the ski talk from yesterday, it was really cool to see that evolution in skiing, and that's my sort of biggest, most exciting thing about what I've done is surviving, creating a company that's now viable, is that there are 4 binding manufacturers. At the macro level, we're the only, outside the pin binding world, which has a ton of micro, we're the only micro company even thinking about the Alpine world. And most of those other companies are pretty set in what they're doing. They're not trying. And that's a enormous engineering and design hurdle to create a better Alpine binding, but that's more the direction we're trying to go.
Okay, that was a lot. But 2 very cool things. One, I love the phrase handcuffed by standards, because if somebody's out there being like, yeah, why aren't these companies doing better? Handcuffed by standards. Another part is, well, maybe skiers aren't asking for this stuff because, to quote a wise man, we're in the age of confusion. So one, the education isn't there, which means manufacturers aren't getting that pressure. But even if there was that growing pressure, then we got to figure out how to get out of the shackles of standards. So I think you guys have done a really good job of kind of explaining. It's not just laying blame. It's like there are actual complexities to all of this. Okay. Whose idea was it to not make this one 3 hours long? But let's pivot to Alpine bindings, and maybe I think you've presented already some really interesting thoughts on the AT side of things. Let's get weird on the Alpine binding side, because actually Lars and Giray, you've both actually said, hey, this is great. These bindings, and standards have existed for many, many decades. And yet, if we were going to be thinking about what innovations could happen on the Alpine binding side in the next 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, help us out. Let's get weird.
I think a huge one happened this year, actually. Head came out with a protector binding. It has a lateral heel release. Knee binding has been around for a long time. Those guys have had some interesting stories in terms of business, and they didn't ever quite bring a product to market that had the retention that it takes. But opening our minds to injuries that bindings can prevent that are not tibial fractures, such as knee injuries, and a lateral heel release, which all tech bindings have, actually does a better job of preventing knee injuries than a lateral toe release. And I think if that could become part of the standard, like it's going to be a tough one, because there's a lot of binding design out there, and it's a really tough one to overcome that retention portion of bindings, which we could get a little more into, but that's a big one. Wider skis are causing tibial plateau fractures because they're putting so much more torque laterally on your knee. There's not a great mechanical solution at your foot for that, but there's just a lot of room for improvement as skis have changed so much. We're not skiing 200 centimeter straight skis anymore, which is
Doing tiny turns.
Tiny turns, you know. There's a lot of different forces. I don't know how Alpine bindings necessarily address that, but there's just room for thought. One of the most frustrating things for me getting into this is how litigious, I guess, the binding industry has become. At one point, it was a product to prevent injury, and then it seems like we created the standards, and then Alpine binding manufacturers shifted from creating products to defending products in court. You know, if you ironically use the word safety around an Alpine binding engineer, they'll be like, don't say that, because if you tell someone your binding is safe, they will sue you when they get hurt. And it's like as simple as that. Like just shifting that to being like, let's go back to problem solving and create something that is safer than what we have. Like there's no way you will ever prevent all injuries. And I think it's an intangible thing. It's something people feel when they ski bindings, but it's really hard to express. But the retention in bindings is far more important than release in a lot of respects. Retention prevents all upper body injuries, head injuries, neck injuries. Like if your skis stay on and you don't fall, you didn't break your neck by your skis coming off. If your skis release, you didn't break your leg. So that aspect is really hard to quantify. It's much easier to just test the torque when a binding comes off a leg than it is to figure out how much force that binding absorbed and didn't come off. And that's just sort of, I think, what the current standard achieves, and a lot of people know intuitively by skiing different bindings. You know, like the Shift passes all the same standards as the Pivot 18. If you go ski those two bindings side by side, set at the same release value, you're gonna have very different results in your skiing. And that's, like I said, known sort of intuitively, but really hard to quantify. And that's, I think, something people don't really realize that their bindings are doing when they're skiing.
Giray, your turn. You spend much time thinking about this?
I might spend a little
I'm
more
listening
time.
to Lars right now, thinking about the areas that I agree upon, and he mentioned something that struck me very specifically, that so many of these injuries are a result of binding retention. And I can speak that a lot of my injuries have been caused by one ski coming off when it should not, and the other failing to release after that. That's led to multiple torn MCLs, a full-blown Achilles.
Yeah, I did my Achilles exactly that way last March.
So if those skis would have stayed on, or I don't know, if I had locked out a pin, would I have been completely fine in this circumstance?
I mean, it's the impossible problem of, like, if you're skiing at a high level or whatever aggressively, the retention value that you need. I mean, after, like, DIN 10 is like your bones break. Like, there should have never been above DIN 10. That was from what I have been told.
Yes, that is the highest.
That is the
chart
highest.
sort of ends there.
That's
and then it
like,
goes to,
then you're
Say more
like,
on this. I don't think many people have heard this. There
That-
shouldn't be higher than a DIN
Like, DIN 10 was like your legs, bones are breaking.
Because I only
But-
ski 18, so
yeah,
I,
That's a specific fall, though.
No.
Yeah, but
I mean,
that's the problem.
I've taken like DIN 15, landed on a cliff back seat, and exploded upwards and come out of my bindings.
Yeah, but that's the point is like,
Nothing happened.
it's not like the retention is what you need to achieve high performance skiing and these impacts and all this stuff. It's so much higher than injury. Like you could fall off. I've known people who get off the chairlift and someone takes them out and they blow their ACL because of a twisting slow fall. And like you need a DIN of 0.5 to come out of your ski. So it's like, it's not a consistent, what kind of retention failure would cause an injury doesn't actually equate to like what the retention of skiing at any kind of level with impacts and different, Like it doesn't make sense. Like it doesn't actually make sense. That's why there's no safety binding. Because if you had a safety binding, the din would be 0.5, and you like lean forward to buckle your boots, and you come out of your binding.
Yeah.
But then if you get off the chairlift and someone takes you out, you come under your binding, and you don't blow your ACL. So it's like it's not a like a thing where you can just say, well, I have din 15 and I'm never going to come out, but suddenly I come out perfectly every time. Like it's not. They can't quantify. There's too many things going on, too many directions, too much force, too much, like you can't do it, or no one has been able to do it. Like
Tough one, yeah.
the Alpine bindings are great, but like they can't solve ACL problems of people falling over in an awkward situation at slow motion. Everyone blows their knee. It's a common thing. It's like, well, I just fell over, sat down, and like my knees, and that's it. Like, oh, or you tomahawked like crazy and you're fine. And your skis came off or they didn't or whatever. So it's so random. Your joints, your bones, everything is not made to have a 2-meter lever on it going in every direction. Like it's a very tough problem. It's a super tough problem.
That's a rabbit hole. I think
Yes.
the standard was written for essentially like the crash test dummy. 90th percentile male under certain circumstances, and that was the torque and just straight lateral torque. 10 was essentially the highest that 200-pound 6'4" man's leg would break at in straight torque. But when you're not moving slow, when you're moving fast, you have more momentum. Your binder's really like, I know I've now turned my dins down, but when I competed, I would, I'm 150 pounds. I would ski with my dins at 16, and I would be conscious of it. It was like skiing a pin binding. If I was in a comp run, I knew my skis weren't come off unless I was moving quickly. They would still release super reliably if I was falling at speed, and I would, I wouldn't always be in perfect control of my tomahawks, but I would be like, all right, I'm about to hit hard. This is where my skis should come off, and like flex through my bindings, my skis would release, But if I was skiing a groomer, I would be very conscious not to let my tip hook, and that was just a personal experience of knowing the forces that I apply to the binding, and it applies back on me, and that standard was figured out, just as best they could, essentially against a test dummy, like in a lab with what the strength of the bone is versus what, it was very much just scientific of where your leg should break at this torque. And I think to Hoji's point, it's actually somewhat accurate. Like if you're moving slow and you just apply that torque slowly, it's probably gonna break your leg if it's above a 10 and you're my size. But if you apply it with force, it won't. And that's, binding's trying to do a lot, I guess, of things. And it's a hard dynamic, and I think that the industry has recognized that there are bindings that go above 10, and within testing bindings, you're supposed to test bindings based on experience. Like if you are experiencing pre-releases, you should adjust your bindings accordingly and turn them up. There's a shop setting, but then there's a lot of range that people don't realize that the industry has accepted that you can put into that adjustment and still be indemnified and cover everything. And that's, just go to a shop. You can request 2 over recommended, no questions asked, because you know your history. But then when manufacturers test bindings, there's a whole on like actual physical testing and those results, and it's essentially you ski them as low as you can and you continue turning them up until you stop experiencing pre-release, because that is the most important thing in preventing all the other injuries.
That makes sense, but that's the point where you do have that injury, unfortunately.
Exactly, yeah.
'Cause I think we've all been there of experiencing the lower din and trying to be safe, and you're like, well, I pre-released. Get up to that point, and then you take a fall that's extraordinarily different than the rest, that does not make sense in your mind for years after it, and that's the one that you got severely injured on. Yeah. And that's the thing. You build up so much trust in this system going from 8 din, 9 din, 10 din, and what happens in life isn't linear. It's not at all.
Yeah.
So that fall is not going to happen in that same way. And a lot of times, like pushing it as athletes, yeah, we're riding at a super high din and we're pushing the limits, but a lot of times it's like the really small circumstance that ends up being the one that hurts you the most.
I mean, I think that for me, that just, to bring this all the way back, is we're falling down mountains with fucking wood on our feet.
Yeah.
Like, it's not a safe
absurd.
endeavor. Yeah, like
They've
expecting products to save us from that isn't realistic. Like, if you make a mistake when you're doing that, you're probably going to get hurt one way or another.
They've done a pretty good job.
To be honest, that's
Everything
exactly what I was
considered,
thinking.
like,
Yeah.
that's it. Like,
Yeah.
there's so many other factors of like, was the binding adjusted properly for your foot? And I can tell from like the customer service stuff I'm doing that people have brand new boots. You mentioned this earlier, the settings, brand new boots, and they'll have like a millimeter of play up and down in their binding for their AFD adjust. They had new bindings, they had this, that. Maybe they swapped out a boot, but did they take it to that shop and get it approved? So there's so much human element. And then every time your boot wears, did you account for that? And so maybe that fall and the injury is a result of that. There's a lot of factors. All of our bodies are so different. And I don't know, did you go read the latest like exercise program before going out and skiing and do the last 3 months training for that fall?
No.
All that plays into it.
I love,
If we wanted to get into the Alpine, like where could we
yeah.
go?
Yeah.
I mean, we're dealing with like this essentially plate on the bottom of your foot for skis that were 60 something millimeters and this kind of toe and heel lug. And like everyone here is walking around like robots. And but that's where it could actually change. And they tried in the 70s and 80s, there's all kinds of, and it just never made it. But like by today's standards and what's going on and like what people want and the width of the skis and like walking around, and not even for touring, but like you could delete all that whole thing except for like Alpine racing and make something that's actually much more usable for everyone out there, I believe. And also considering like a big thing with Alpine bindings is snow, icing, grip walk, chewed up. Like it's just, you're clamping something in that if there's anything in the way, you're compromised. And it happens all the time. And like, so you could think outside of that and make something completely different than nothing that we could think of. You could look back to that stuff from the 80s and 70s, and like with today's mindset and technology or whatever, you could achieve the same results that we have with this block on your foot, only designed for race skis basically, in like a consumer way, I think. But it's the same problem with you could make bigger pins, you could do all this stuff, but like, you can't, we're handcuffed to this, like from 1950, whatever, I think it is, like when skis were like this and no one cared, you just après-ski and fell over and no one cared because you're in Europe and it doesn't matter.
I think to see that innovation, we would need to see boot manufacturers working directly with the binding and having like the full integration system where you're not going to meet those standards. They're going to be thrown out.
Completely deleted. But like how many there's major powerhouse players that make boots, bindings, and skis.
But totally not cross-compatible. Everything that we make now is cross-compatible. It's going to be...
But it has to be so much better to I mean, look, low-tech, it was so much better than all the other touring stuff for uphill performance. Yes. And even that took 20-something years of fighting and all this stuff just to get it. And now it's everywhere. But so the industry is like it's manufacturing. Electric vehicles or whatever. Like it takes so much time. You could have something so much more advanced, but like it takes so much time to like make that work. So that's what we're dealing with, in my opinion. And we're just skiing. It's fun. Like we've got pieces of wood strapped to our feet, and we're wiggling our ass, and hopefully we're not breaking our knees. You know.
That's what it is. Yeah.
let's open this up to just a couple of questions. So the question is, from each of your particular perspectives and roles you're playing in these different companies, this world of ski boots, and then the accompanying bindings playing nicer together and creating sort of the ideal system, given where your different kind of companies lay on the spectrum, what would that look like? Giray, you got to go
I'm
first
thinking
because this
about,
one's
like,
hard.
For me, if I'm thinking about my greatest problem out there for the way that I want to ski is, if I'm going to go do a huge approach to something and ski that line the way I want to do it, it's not going to be on my lightweight gear that I have. So if I need to get further out there and trust my bindings, I need a lighter weight downhill binding. I need to break the 1,000-gram barrier for a trustable binding for downhill. We can make an adapter system, whatever, super light. We get a 200-gram one. Great, but then my boot that I trust too needs to get lighter and lighter. Pairing everything up is super important in my mind. So when I have someone who's going on like a burly downhill ski with metal reinforced, and then they go and ski a super lightweight touring boot in that, and they're like, oh, this boot's not enough, or like my system's not light enough. I'm like, well, like think about losing weight on the ski. Pair every single thing up, like cut your toenails, don't eat that burrito, lose some weight everywhere. And so like look at everything as a whole, and your performance will get so much better. And I look at how I tore my Achilles, and I rode my full-on powder ski. It's not metal reinforced, but I have a pivot binding on it. It's 117 powder ski, fairly strong, and I used a touring boot that day. And normally I'd use a downhill boot, and I folded that in half. And so didn't have the release. I would have used my lighter weight ski that's more flexible and a little bit more rocker in it to pair with that boot and say a lighter binding. I feel like it wasn't necessarily the binding's fault that I blew my Achilles. So would I love to have like a lighter binding on that? Yeah, those things. But thinking about your system as a whole is like what I need to do, and where I think a lot of people need to think about the whole issue and their setup.
Lars?
I would just sort of second that. I think it's not quite addressing the question, but I think from a consumer standpoint, and Hoji got into that earlier, thinking about what you're doing, whether you're putting, a touring boot in a Pivot 18, and just like, I think that's sort of why I tried to get pin bindings to work back in the day, but I wasn't comfortable in a touring boot, and I was skiing. I was converting my full race boot, and I just had so much more power than the binding could handle that I was like, this isn't going to work. And it was mostly driven by my boot, And I think that's where Hoji where he's got a system that's light all the way throughout, and he skis it accordingly. And it's realizing that from your own perspective, as this new big 4-buckle Dynafit boot came out, it looks awesome, but I wouldn't go put that in a super light and put it on my 194 charge skis. Like, you're then going to have your point of failure be the binding. And it's not the binding's fault. It wasn't designed to handle either of those things. So from a consumer standpoint, being conscious of that and getting your, what you're using to all sort of get together is super important, whether it's just having the right AFD or pairing your ski with your boot and having the right binding in between. That doesn't really get to the question of, I don't know what black magic we're
Yeah, maybe
with.
The ideal setup of pairing the manufacturers.
But that is very important. I'm glad it led us there. I don't know, I guess, is my answer to that question. That's a very tough one to solve, and I think it would just take I don't know what company has that ability. I feel like we're in a unique place to try to lead, but we can't create a binding if there isn't a boot, that works with it. And boots and bindings are both extremely, I guess, tooling, and they're extremely intensive in terms of amount of development and then production cost that goes into all those, every part of a binding, I've got tools for every part of my binding that are more complex than my binding. And it's like, that's something people don't, in boot, I couldn't even imagine getting into making boots, like how many different molds you need for that. I cut injection molds for tiny little parts, like in a whole line of boots is just so much commitment to cost, and it's a hard one to overcome.
Well, I mean, that's from the Alpine side, that's like exactly why it is the way it is, because it works somehow, it is standard, and like those bindings are made so coarsely, there's no precision, it's just rivet stamped together, it works super well, but they've developed that after so many years to be very efficient to make, I mean, you would know this from what you've developed and gone through, and going to dealing with tech interface and everything, like it's every tolerance chain, every kind of detail that you have to be precise on. Like Alpine bindings are very good at not being that precise. And 1 millimeter up and down, and like not that that's a bad thing. It's like a better thing because it becomes easier to manufacture and cheaper, and everyone can get them, and they can make them as they do. So it becomes really tough. That was one of the things that held tech bindings back, was it was a precision made little machine that's not just a clamping thing that can tolerate all these different tolerances. Like it's a very precise thing comparatively to Alpine bindings, and that's why they were expensive, or they're still expensive. So you want to get into manufacturing, like I didn't just touch on that, but I don't even know, but it gets the more precise something has to be, the more expensive and costly, and like when you're saying with the pin, like it becomes crazy. Like to get everyone aligned on to finally answer the question, like, yes, how do you get Solomon, Tyrolia, Marker, look, and sit them in a room and tell them like, okay, let's just do, like, we know the problems. Like the number one thing about all of this is like, we know the problems, or we could try and identify with Alpine bindings, with tech bindings, with hybrid bindings. And that's the point, is like identifying those problems and limitations and starting over and with something without being like, we have to fulfill this, we have to fulfill this, and this, and like forget all that, forget everything. But to get all those big manufacturers and small manufacturers to sit down at a table like we're doing right now and talk about it reasonably and not be trying to outdo each other, forget it, like
Sounds like the conversation we should have next year at the Blister Summit.
Yeah, it's really tough. Like that would be the best.
Yeah.
Like in a fantasy world, you just get all the people at those companies that are actually doing the work, and like everyone knows the problems and limitations, and like we collectively sit down and say, okay, we know all that. That's the most important parts of starting over, and where do we go from there? But that's not how like capitalism and like that's not how this works. I'm sorry.
Not yet. Man, you sound so pessimistic.
No, but I'm a realist. Like I'm the happiest guy, but.
So the question is, you've talked a lot about these tolerances and how tight they are. We have many skiers all around the world walking to catch buses and to go ski, to go back from skiing. Do you strongly suggest that people not be walking around in ski boots? Would that, in your opinion, palpably help the issues that you're talking about?
I think that it definitely would not hurt. The frustration for Hoji of grip walk, one of the frustrations is it's created a much smaller contact point with Alpine bindings. You do have a better walkability potentially, but that contact point can be damaged more easily. Alpine bindings is spread out a little more. Alpine, the old standard. Most bindings are adjustable or have a mechanism to adjust. The looks have preload built into them, so they can accommodate that. Solomons, you got to adjust them. So I think it would just be, yes, it's good to wear boot covers if you're going to be walking a long ways, but also just pay attention to your gear. If your soles are worn out, maybe replace them, you know? And if you've been walking a lot, maybe get your bindings checked again or readjust them to account for that wear. Yeah, there are ways to do it, but boot covers definitely won't hurt. And I guess that's pretty much just Alpine specific. Tech inserts don't get worn out when you're walking.
Giray?
I mean, I feel like Lars
Got it?
nailed it there. It's pretty concise.
Yeah. Hoji?
From what I've seen, just in the field or whatever, is like the problem with grip walk or Alpine is like, and for this walking on the street and gravel, maybe it's not like, yeah, over time, yes, for sure. I mean, boot cut, that's why they have the cat tracks or whatever. It's great, actually. Probably you should use them for sure. And it's, the thing I've seen is not even that it depends what kind of skiing you're doing, of course, but like for powder skiing and ski touring and all the things that are going on, it's that the plastic gets all cut up and it becomes this rough surface that just is like, depending on the snow and like here, okay, it's cold right now, nothing's sticking, but like if it gets in kind of up down temperature swing and like your boots are wet and then your step, like it becomes like a magnet to the snow, and then you get so much buildup, and like you have to be meticulous. Like you watch Alpine racing and like there's a guy there with a screwdriver and a scraper ensuring exactly that the binding is going on properly. And like I would speculate that a lot of binding failures, and the same thing happens in tech bindings, there's a few tricks that you have to know that no one talks about to clearing the snow out of the mechanisms. And in Alpine, it's the interface that walking on the street cuts up that nice clean surface, and it becomes a problem with snow buildup or snow holding on, and you have to be careful about that. So it's wear the covers if you're walking on the street, I'd say.
What are the best ways to keep your tech bindings working right?
I mean, this is another question, but the main failure I've seen many times already, several times this year, is that when you're ski touring up, down, up a few different transitions, no one thinks or no one explains that the main thing is that when the jaw, like the toe piece, the springs on the toe piece open and close, any snow that goes under that toe piece gets put under enormous pressure and becomes this ice block. And like most of the time people are getting into their bindings, taking their skis off, putting their skins, whatever, and they do that a few times in the right, you're starting in warm snow at the bottom, you go up to the powder at the top or whatever, colder snow, and you get this ice block that's basically sitting underneath the spring assembly, underneath the jaws of the pins of the toe piece, and this is basically like blocking the binding from closing properly. And most people step in and okay, it's in somehow, and they click in. Like the correct procedure from what I've seen and been shown and done for 10 years is, as soon as you want to put your ski on, you look, okay, there's some snow under there, ice, doesn't matter, and you just open and close that binding toe piece several times with like a pole handle. This is one of the main things I teach to people who are getting into ski touring. Like every time, like look, see. It's the same as clearing off your soles on your Alpine boots. You have to get that snow out of there or it's not closed. And click, 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 and if you hold the ski vertically, it all comes out. And then you click into the toe piece, and I recommend every time, like, lock the toe piece and ensure that it's completely engaged, and pick your heel up, and you swing. You basically do this swinging motion, and because all the pins have like a channel in them, it's like an auger, and if there's any snow in the pinholes of the insert of the toe piece, it basically digs it out. And because you've locked the toe piece, you know it's closed, and then you step into the heel, and then you put it into the unlock position in the toe. And if you do that meticulously, to develop that is the same as like clearing off your soles of your Alpine boots before you step in your Alpine bindings, you'll probably have a very successful chance that your binding's actually on properly. But this isn't a common thing that people know. And a lot of bindings get stepped into. There's ice under the toe. They never locked it. It's not even in, and they go skiing. I mean, I did this twice already this year, watching a ski come at me for hundreds of meters and like playing the football guy receiver and stomping on it, and then looking and like there's an ice chunk under the thing and under the toe piece, and the guy, yeah, no chance, you know. So yeah,
This is
hot tip.
hot tip.
Get it out there.
This is my promise. We're going to have a hell of a lot more binding talk on Blister, on some Gear 30 podcasts with you all. This is exactly what I wanted tonight. This was not about finding definitive solutions, but I think you all have done an incredible job of priming the pump and getting us to think through all the different components of what's happening. And that is actually what I really wanted to happen tonight. And so I'm very, very grateful to all of you for that. So to be continued. I'm making your fantasy panel session happen right here next year. That's another promise.
Oh, me.
But-
I've got a great question to forward onto that panel
Okay,
too.
good.
I want to
Well,
see that's weird.
You all be here next year too then, but we'll keep this going. But let's solve
Can
some
it
of
be
this.
like the UN, like everyone has like
Yes.
headphones with like different
Yes, we could do that. Anyway, seriously, many, many thanks to you all. And I think we've all learned a lot, and probably each of us has a different thought or two or hot tip to take away. So thank you very much. To be continued. Thanks, everybody.